With narcissism, I was able to see the ego in full action. It's hard to see the ego gone, but you can really see ego working and understand it a little better. So narcissists are sort of an extreme version of ego, but we all have ego. We're all chasing things and hiding from things. So it's easy to see with narcissism, but it's something we all struggle with.
Welcome back to another episode of COVID-19 from Crisis to Creation here on Mentorit TV. I'm Patricia Falco-Becalli, your host. Well, in today's episode, I thought we are going to look at one of the biggest pandemics apart from COVID-19, and that is narcissism, a personality trait that has been spreading like wildfire over the last couple of decades. What is it? How do you recognize it? How do you deal with it? Is maybe a little bit of narcissism in all of us? And where does self-confidence stop and narcissism start? And most importantly, what happens if we find ourselves under the reign of narcissistic political leaders? Well, in order to discuss all of this, I invited the expert when it comes to narcissism, and he's been studying the subject for the last 30 years, is about to come out with his third book called The New Science of Narcissism. Please welcome with me Dr. W. Keith Campbell. Dr. Campbell, thank you so much for joining us for this discussion here on Mentorit TV.
Oh, thanks for having me, Patricia.
Well, this is an incredible subject. And if you look at celebrities, if you look at politicians, if you look at anybody that is really not only successful but famous for it, you'll expect there's a bit of narcissism. But what I want to ask, first of all, before we dig into the deep of that personality trait, Dr. Campbell, is why are you so fascinated in this personality trait, so much so that you've been actually studying it for the last 30 years?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. And when I started looking at narcissism, it was back at a time where people were interested in these questions of self-enhancement and stealing responsibility from people or blaming other people for your failure. So there's a lot of interest in that in the field. And I looked at it, and it turns out certain people are more selfish than others, and those are narcissists. So there's a real obvious reason to get into it from the science. So there's a personal reason why I study narcissism as well. And when I was younger, I was very interested in egolessness, or how you can sort of remove the ego from the system in a more Buddhist sense. With narcissism, I was able to see the ego in full action. It's hard to see the ego gone, but you can really see ego working and understand it a little better. So narcissists are sort of an extreme version of ego, but we all have ego. We're all chasing things and hiding from things. So it's easy to see with narcissism, but it's something we all struggle with.
Yeah. Now, right at the beginning of your book, actually, in chapter 5, page 77, you say the current popular use of narcissists in everyday conventional highlights the biggest misconception out there, that narcissism and narcissistic personality disorder, NPD, are the same. To provide context, that's like saying sadness and depression are the same. What is the real definition of narcissism? How do we actually really have to understand it?
Yes. So people use the term narcissism, and they often using it just to mean somebody who's kind of a jerk. So they don't really know jerk is a little kind of a weak term. Narcissistic makes you sound sophisticated. But really, when we talk about narcissism, we're using it in a couple different ways. The first and most common way is as a personality trait, meaning narcissism is something we all have. Some people have very low levels, some people have very high levels. When we define narcissism as a trait, it's a combination of sort of self-importance and entitlement. I think I'm better than people. I deserve special treatment. I'm a little bit callous, a little bit self-centered. And there's a grandiose form of that where you have that callousness, but you're also energized, you're extroverted, you're status seeking, you can be very charismatic. And that combination of traits we talk about as grandiose narcissism. And mostly when we're talking about narcissistic leaders or narcissistic celebrities or that person we had that terrible relationship with, grandiose narcissism. There's another trait of narcissism which people talk about, which is vulnerable narcissism. It's a combination of sort of self-importance. I'm a legend, but I also have low self-esteem. I'm not very confident. I'm easily threatened. I'm very vulnerable. These folks, you don't end up dating quite as often, but they end up in therapy. So therapists, when they see narcissism, see a lot of insecurity, but that's not typical of narcissism. That's this more vulnerable form. Finally, if you have these narcissistic traits and they're so extreme that they impair your life, meaning I'm so narcissistic that my wife left me because I started cheating on her, and I'm so narcissistic that I got fired from my job because I made a huge bet on cryptocurrencies and it went wrong, and I tried to blame my assistant, but it didn't work and I got fired. If I mess up my life that much, I can be diagnosed as a personality disorder or narcissistic personality disorder, which is very rare.
So, yeah, but
of the population.
That's the interesting one, though, isn't it? I mean, it is very rare. I think 1 or 2%
Yes.
of the population. It is rare. However, here I think the key issue is impairment. So my behavior, in all of my gloriness, causes you pain, suffering, and perhaps even long-term consequences.
Absolutely. So that impairment is what makes something go from being a personality trait to a personality disorder. And that impairment needs to be diagnosed by a psychiatrist or a medical professional, a psychological professional. And the impairment is often interpersonal in narcissism. You hurt other people around you, but it can also be cognitive distortions. You kind of don't understand the world because you're such a legend. You can't really take negative feedback well. It can be other distortions as well.
Yeah, what I think is very interesting in your book, and the vulnerable narcissist was a little bit of a surprise to me. And if I look at myself, you know, there is sometimes a little bit of an oscillation between having tendency towards the grandiose, but also the vulnerable. But you name Elliot Rodgers and mass shooting as one of the examples to really draw up what a vulnerable narcissist could be like. Could you explain it a little bit, that particular incident that happened back in 2014, and what the pillars are of this vulnerable narcissist?
So the Elliot Rodgers case was a mass shooting. These happen too frequently, but this was a case in California and Santa Barbara area that involved a young man who was an interesting combination of high vulnerability, but also some grandiosity. So he felt like he should have attention. He felt like the young sorority girls should be attracted to him. He didn't understand why his roommates or friends or colleagues were getting dates and he couldn't. He asked a girl out and she didn't respond to him. And so that was enough rejection to set him off. He didn't try again and again and again like a grandiose narcissist would. He just gave up and decided to establish dominance by killing and stabbing people and shooting people. Literally in his manifesto says, I'm going to show you who the real alpha male is. So that's an interesting case where somebody's very vulnerable, but they want to be dominant. They want to have that high status. They don't know how to get there on their charm or charisma because they're kind of insecure. So what they do is they go shoot people. And it's a way around that. It's a very tragic way, but that's how vulnerability can manifest.
Yeah, I thought that was very interesting to see because as I understood that issue was that he totally felt right to vindicate himself. He totally felt right in his act. And there the ego you mentioned earlier on comes into play where rejection hurts your ego. And you can take it so personally because you feel entitled, go like, hey, why does he get the chick and I don't? That you then go, okay, I have to lash out. That's my only way of really, rather than, looking at self-improvement and maybe saying, oh, what's going on with me? Maybe I can improve myself. You just lash out and kill people literally. Yes,
it's very, so that model of rejection to violence or to aggression is very common in narcissism. So you give people ego threats like you're stupid, you're not attractive, or you can't have me, entitlement threats, you can't date me. Those are triggers for aggression with narcissism. You see it with vulnerable and grandiose narcissism.
Yeah. Let me ask you a question. As I was doing my research on it, I was wondering, Dr. Campbell, is narcissism something that is born or bred? So is it nature or nurture?
It's both. What we find, and we're finding this over and over now with personality traits, is they're about 50% heritable. which means that if we look at family patterns, we can predict about 50% of narcissism scores. But that leaves a lot of room for nurture. People are raised a certain way, and these things work together in really interesting combinations. You know, if your parents have the same genetics as the kids, if they're biological, and so it's complicated. The other element is cultural. Some cultures are sort of support narcissism more, some support it less, and so that can play a role as well. So I think all these factors make a difference, but there's definitely, you know, you're born with predispositions to a lot of these traits.
Yeah, and we're going to talk about narcissistic leaders, leadership, especially in this COVID-19 environment as well. What does that do to narcissistic leaders is a good question. And of course, Donald Trump. But before we do that, let me just move on to the areas where we say, okay, we define it. And how do we identify it, Dr. Campbell? I wonder, you know, I don't want to say that everybody had the impression once or twice in their life that their bosses were slightly narcissistic, or even their lovers had something like, hang on, I was in front of the mirror. What are you doing pushing me away? Or vice versa. And so how do you really recognize them? What are the red flags, let's say, in a working environment?
Yeah, so it's a good question, and it's a hard question to answer a bit, because people who are narcissistic, especially grandiose narcissists, are often very likable at first. So if I really like people, it always is a little bit of a red flag for me. I'm like, that person seems so charming and confident. I really related to
that means that you hate me now. We have to hate each other.
Well, I always just put a little check mark in there. I'm like, God, they just seemed really cool. I better let's just give it a second or two before I like them too much. And because extroversion is this trait of narcissism, is very likable. What I often say with people is when we look at the data, the research data on narcissism, where you see somebody is a grandiose narcissist, they're going to be likable, they're going to be a little extroverted, they're going to be relatively well groomed. People are they care more about their appearance. Exactly. You know, that's why television is, you know, there's such a selective pressure for grandiose narcissism in the media, because there's all that pressure to be attractive. It's just the nature of the job. So you have those good looks. If you want to see the more toxic part of narcissism, interpersonal problems, that's very hard to see up front. Sometimes I look at how people treat staff. I look at how they talk about people who are below them in social status. But often what you need to see is somebody's life history. And what you'll see with grandiose narcissists is you'll see a trail of destruction, broken relationships, broken business dealings. And when you ask them about it, they're going to blame everyone else. But that history to me is what differentiates people from real problems. You know, it's just hard to really nail people when I first meet them. I mean, it's just not that easy.
Yeah. And it's an interesting one. For example, the psychologist, I'm sure you know her, Dr. Ramani Durvasala. And she actually says that narcissism is really the exact opposite of self-love. It really is a kind of opposite of self-confidence. It is a psychological, a pathological insecurity, where she actually says that often narcissists are just hiding their ego that is that big, you know, blowing it up in front of everybody else, just portraying what they're really not inside. Would you agree with that?
So I would say that is something you see with vulnerable narcissism. But with grandiose narcissism, I don't know Putin, I don't know Trump. I don't think either of them look in the mirror and think, you know, I'm really a little child who just needs some affection. I'm really not that good. I don't think
we'll talk about Trump a little later on, Dr. But do you remember when he said, I think it was only just last week, when his ratings were kind of raised by Dr. Fauci, and he said, nobody likes me. You know, I can only be the way I am. That's all. I mean, that's a quote now. And you just think, okay, that is something that a 3-year-old would say.
Yeah. There's vulnerability always looks a little silly. Yeah. But generally, I think a lot of people who are grandiose inside and out, that they're just kind of arrogant people, and there's deep down, you don't really find this scared little boy. You do with vulnerability, but you don't with a lot of people. They're just built a certain way.
Yeah. And I think what is very interesting as well, narcissistic relationships, love relationships. How do you how do you not fall into the trap? I mean, you talk about charisma, you talk about charm, you talk about, you know, this person that blows you away and you go like, yes, I like this. How do you really look beyond that and say, again, that might be actually toxic long term?
I mean, it's very hard to do. And I give this example of eating chocolate cake versus eating something healthy, like a salad with chicken or whatever. And every time somebody says, you want the chocolate cake? I'm like, chocolate cake is awesome. I want to eat it. And then I eat it and I feel sick. And lots of times people who are very confident, extroverted narcissists, they have things that are really appealing. Those are appealing qualities. And you get involved with somebody like that, and the way relationships work is you fall for the appealing stuff, and then you're waiting over time. You're like, whoa, the emotional intimacy is going to come, and we're really going to get to know each other and become a team. With people who are narcissistic, you get all the sizzle, the fun stuff, the excitement, but the commitment and caring doesn't happen. So what you're getting is really like half a relationship. And it just doesn't work well. And what you find, people who are really attracted to narcissists will have a lot of short-term relationships and they'll fall apart, or else they'll stick with it a long time and just deal with the problems. Challenge.
I think you're touching there on something, if I may read between the lines, Dr. Campbell, and that is the lack of empathy and perhaps being manipulative, but not manipulative in the sense that trying to make you a better person because I love you, but manipulating you so you serve me better.
Exactly. It's imagine I'm narcissistic, I'm in a relationship, I really like the status, I've got my attractive significant other, we do cool stuff, that's great. I'm not really that interested in the emotional intimacy. A little bit's great, but I don't really want it that much. And there's a lot of things I like doing more. Like I'd like to date more people. I'd like to get a new car. I'd like to take a trip. So I'd rather do those things than focus on this emotional stuff. I'm not that interested anyway. It's not really what I'm all about. And so it makes relationships hard to take to the next level. Basically. So
that means that, you know, are narcissists actually safe from narcissists? What happens if two narcissists end up dating, or doesn't it happen because, you know, it takes one to know one?
No, I think that's a great point. I wish I had more research on this, and I'm going to just talk based on, this is just me looking at a bunch of correlations over the years. It seems like you find people who are narcissistic that match will be probably better. Meaning that if you have two people that are kind of shallow and kind of materialistic, if you get the two of them together, it's going to work better than if you have somebody who's shallow and materialistic and the other person that's, I want real deep emotional intimacy. I can do shallow for about 3 or 4 months, but then I want it to get deep. That's where you're going to find the problems.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Do you feel that this me, myself, and I culture has been hugely influenced, Dr. Campbell, also by the social media? Because today, you know, I'm here, I'm doing Mentoring TV. It takes 2 seconds and I can blast the world with it. I don't need a film studio. I don't need anybody that is a big network to hire me in order to get close to audience. Has social media been an incubator for narcissism?
Yes, and it's very interesting. I started looking at this with my student Laura Baffardi. This was, God, it's been 10 years. It's been more than 10 years when Facebook came out. And I said, this Facebook thing's crazy. We got to look at narcissism. And it turns out, and we've replicated this a lot, that people on social media who are narcissistic have more connections. They have more friends, they have more followers, they have more likes, they have these broad, shallow social networks. And they do well. Taking selfies is hard for people, but if you're a grandiose narcissist, it's not that hard. It's kind of fun because you like to look at yourself and show people. So the social media is attractive to people who are narcissistic. They tend to do well on it. When you go on social media, you're going to see more narcissism than in the real world because the narcissistic friends of yours are going to be posting more, and they're always showing something a little positive. But what you're talking about with media is this process where the studios were disintermediated by individuals in social media. And the Kardashians, it's not, who am I thinking of? Not Kardashian, her sister.
Yes.
Was
Jenner, what's her name?
Jenner, yeah, Khloe. Is that Khloe? Yeah, she was, one of the she's a genius. And I remember I was teaching my social psych class, and they were watching her driving around a Ferrari instead of listening to me. And I went, what are you watching? I mean, this is silly. And then it hit me. I'm like, oh my God, she just disintermediated the entire network world and is going straight to people, and she's going to be a billionaire. She is a genius. Ego, you need ego to do that.
You need ego to do that. And I think this is such an interesting segue into the economy, Dr. Campbell, because there we are so close to people that are amongst the youngest billionaires in the world. They have their Ferraris, Lamborghinis, and whatever brand on their body. I want it too. Everybody wants it too. So the next thing to do in order to get the bling is you go to the next bank and you leverage whatever little you have in order to be glorious, glamorous, attractive as those people that you see on social media. Do you think there is actually a link between this culture of buying on debt, compiling debt as long as I can, show who I really would like to be, but I am actually not?
Absolutely. I wrote a book a while ago, looking at cultural change and looking at the no income loans in America for houses and stuff. So this has been going on a long time. What debt does is it allows you or me or anyone to be as grandiose as we want until the debt fairy comes and takes us away. And if we're powerful and connected enough, the debt fairy never takes our debt. They just roll it over. If we're a big bank, we can just do this forever and they're going to bail us out forever. If I'm just a normal schmo, they're probably going to come and take my house and my car after 5-6 months, but I can do anything I want with that leverage. And so this debt, I think, is potentially very toxic psychologically, because it allows people to sort of overlive and gets into trouble. We find with narcissism and finance, they tend to do well in bull markets. So if there's a bull market, people who are narcissistic do well because they're risk-taking and they're overconfident. And so they'll do very well. And then when the market changes, they just get slaughtered, unless they can find someone to bail them out, or they're running money 2 and 20 in a hedge fund. And then they just take their 2% and shut down and start another one.
Yeah. Well, we've seen that often enough, Dr. Campbell. Let me then ask you a question about the imposter syndrome. As far as I know, in my little knowledge about psychology, the imposter syndrome being that you do what you do it confidently. You kind of think, wow, people see me in this light. Am I really that good? Am I really that grand? And inside, the little child comes out, and the ego again is a little bit less loud. Do you believe that narcissists do have a little bit of an imposter syndrome feeling?
Imposter syndrome, I think, is a very important construct, and it's something I like how you describe it. I often think of it when you take a new social role. So you become you're a director, or you're a department head, or you're whatever role you have, and you first get there, you go, I shouldn't be doing this. I'm a freaking moron. Why would they call me professor? I mean, I barely could get out of bed 10 years ago. And so that's an imposter syndrome, and that's normal, but that's more common for people who are neurotic or a little anxious, a little apprehensive, vulnerable narcissism. People who are grandiose, they're kind of like, I've been waiting for this spot. This chair's been kept warm for me my whole life. I'm destined to be the king. But, I'm much more neurotic. Whenever I level up, I'm like, oh my God, what did I just pull on the world?
Same here. I'm just thinking, okay, fake it till you make it. You will get there one day, whether this day,
right.
I have no idea. Yeah.
Right. But if you're very grandiose, you're not really questioning as much. You kind of feel like it was preordained. So different life. Different life.
Yeah. Naughty question, Dr. Campbell. Are people like Mother Teresa, Gandhi, Mandela, Bob Geldof, are these narcissists by doing good, so much so that they have become real celebrities?
I'm not going to call Mother Teresa a narcissist on any program ever. I don't know Mother Teresa. I visited her orphanage a long time ago and thought they did good work. But I think that you can do good for egotistic reasons. And you can align your goodness with narcissism. Sometimes we call this communal narcissism. People that are like, I'm the best, most moral person you'll ever see in your life. No one's had a better friend than me. So we have a form of narcissism like that, but I think that people can use these more altruistic routes to gain social power and status, and it's kind of the same deal. You just cover it up with a little bit of a do-gooder cover. I don't know, Gandhi. I mean, I'm not getting down that rabbit hole.
Okay, no. No, but there are people that do philanthropy also, of course, in order to be seen for it as the good guy. And rightly so, they're doing a lot. You could talk about the economics of mutuality or just giving back.
Right.
And creating so much. So it is, again, maybe a double-edged sword, a fine line, but I thought it was interesting.
Yeah, well, can I ask you this? Was Bob Geldof the one with his yacht recently on Instagram that was taking the drone shots and turned out people didn't think he was as cool as he thought?
Well,
yeah, that was an interesting case where I think this is somebody who just got his wires crossed. He's like, I'm a do-gooder. I do good things. I'm a knight. Everyone loves me. Check out my mega yacht and the drone footage. And people are like, too soon, man. I'm living in my basement with 5 kids. I don't want to see your mega yacht.
Yeah, exactly. This is what exactly. So it can backfire. Now,
absolutely.
In terms of dealing with narcissists, Dr. Campbell, what would you say are the 3 main things one have to always kind of keep in mind, saying, hey, I'm meeting the new boss, I'm meeting whoever, really, potential relationship that you have to, how do you deal with them, especially in the work environment? You can't just end in your job, go to the next
right
boss.
I would think if it's a new relationship, the 2 things I keep in mind is defense and offense, just the simple way to think about it. I meet somebody new, they're narcissistic. I quickly think, what power do they have over me and how can they take advantage of me and how do I protect myself? I don't tell anyone that. I just kind of look at what they're doing, what their tools are, what my tools are, and I figure out how they can't interfere with my life too much, to the extent possible. And then I figure out how to get them to like me. Not complicated. People in charge are usually pretty competent at some level. They did something right. They pleased somebody. I figure out what it is. Usually if somebody's got an ego, you just tell them you respect them and you want to be on their team and help them be famous. I mean, and not steal the limelight from them. And I think people, so you figure out how to deal with somebody who wants to be a do-gooder. You say, thanks for helping me. You're a real good person. Mm-hmm. And they feel good. Somebody who's narcissistic, you say, look, I'm going to help you be king, and I'm not going to take any of the credit. And then they go, yeah, I'm going to give you a small piece of the pie, Keith. Yeah. Not a whole piece, but I'll give you a tiny piece.
It's a deal. It's a little bit sucking up to the person in power, which you might never own yourself. So yeah, it is. I think it's something you need to literally manage. Yeah.
And I try to be conscious of it. I'm like, look, I'm dealing with somebody's ego. That's fine. I can deal with ego. Ego is, of all the problems people have, ego is a pretty simple one. Versus sort of this more like, it's not some deep pathology. It's just, I got an arrogant jerk as a boss again. Big deal. I just suck up a little bit, try to stay out of their way and hope they leave.
And yeah, exactly. And do help in the meantime. Now, I want to ask you also, Dr. Campbell, what can we learn from a narcissist? I picked up a quote here I would like to read out to you, which I thought was interesting. Productive narcissists have the audacity to push through the massive transformations that society periodically undertakes. So that sounds to me, without narcissists, we wouldn't have had any kind of evolvement as a society, be it in technology, business, or even as human.
I think that you can have change without narcissism, but when you have change, you always have destruction. You have a society that works and somebody says, I'm going to change it. That means I'm destroying something. Often that can happen with technology. So I can invent this new thing and I'm not narcissistic, but that new technology will mess it up, or new vision, a new art. But with narcissism, you need to have the confidence that things are not as good as they could be, and I'm the person to make them better. So you got to have an ego to do that. You can't, if you're sort of a shrinking violent, you're not going to go destroy a system and make it better. So narcissists are change agents in a lot. I mean, they're kind of like the beavers in the, in the forest. They will change a lot of systems because they have the ego and confidence to do it. Is it always good? No. Yeah. Not at all. It's a disaster half the time. But they're the ones who are going to do it because everyone else is sitting around getting along.
Yes. And what would you say is the key learning from a narcissist we could take away from?
I think, I mean, if I had to sit down, the people who are really narcissistic, I kind of admire their willingness to just go do stuff, to have an ego and to do it. I don't admire the harm they inflict, and sometimes the thoughtlessness of what they do, and sometimes the self-servingness of what they do. But leadership and changing is, I mean, it's not for the faint of heart, I mean, you got to have an ego to do it, some ego at least.
Yes, and leadership is exactly the key word, Dr. Campbell. We'll wrap up the first part of our interview where we kind of discussed narcissism in general and in various formations, be it at business, with your relationship, and also with social media. We're now moving on to the second part, which is looking a little bit closer to what narcissistic political leadership can bring in terms of positive input and also in terms of negative input. And this is also why we're going to look at President Donald Trump.